Did you know that a single day can completely change the course of global economic history? The 1929 stock market crash was one of those extraordinary moments. In just a few hours, fortunes vanished, and a wave of despair spread across millions of lives. But was it simply driven by unchecked greed? Or are there deeper mysteries behind the collapse that triggered the greatest economic crisis of the 20th century? What few people realize is that the impact of this event goes far beyond the stock market. It shaped society, culture, and even global politics in ways we still feel today. Want to understand how? Stay with me, and let's uncover this fascinating and historic phenomenon together. The economic landscape before the crash. In the years leading up to the 1929 crash, the United States was experiencing an era of unprecedented optimism and growth. After World War I, the economy expanded rapidly, driven by industrialization and technological innovations. It was a time when the extraordinary seemed to be the norm. The stock market became the ultimate symbol of this progress, attracting investors from all walks of life, from big business tycoons to ordinary citizens. Easy credit and the belief that the stock market would only continue to rise fueled a frenzy of speculation. With the high demand for stocks, their prices soared far above their actual value, creating a bubble that no one saw coming. However, this blind optimism concealed dangerous mysteries. While the economy appeared to be thriving, cracks were beginning to show that most people ignored. The rapid growth wasn't based on solid foundations, but rather on a speculative bubble that gave the illusion of easy wealth. At this point, much of the population had little understanding of the risks involved, and many invested their life savings in the market. It seemed like a smart move, until the relentless nature of the financial system began to reveal its flaws. Easy credit, offered by banks, allowed investors to buy stocks with a small initial payment, a practice known as buying on margin. This gave the illusion that the stock market was accessible to everyone, further increasing its popularity. The problem was that this practice created a dangerous dependence on market fluctuations. If stock values dropped, investors wouldn't be able to repay their debts, and the banks would be exposed. It was like building castles in the sand, with few recognizing the fragility of the situation. As speculation grew, warnings started to emerge. Economists and some market analysts began questioning how long this euphoria could last. They knew the economy wasn't as strong as it seemed, and that the incredible growth was being fueled by a bubble ready to burst. However, greed and the desire for quick profit blinded many. When the market showed signs of decline, some believed it was just a temporary correction, allowing the speculation to continue growing uncontrollably. While the middle class and small investors were caught up in the excitement, large, more influential, and intelligent investors began to see that something extraordinary was about to happen. Many quietly started selling their stocks while prices were still high, without drawing attention. This quiet sell-off was one of the first signs that a major crash was imminent. But the blind confidence, fed by years of growth, kept people from seeing the dangers ahead. By 1929, the stock market had turned into a kind of gambling game, where people believed they could win without understanding the rules. The mystery of how it would all collapse hung in the air, but no one knew what would trigger the fall. The economy seemed on the verge of something innovative or catastrophic, setting the stage for one of the most influential moments in world financial history. The market collapse, Black Thursday. October 24th, 1929, became known as Black Thursday, marking the beginning of the stock market's collapse. On that day, panic gripped Wall Street as stock prices began to plummet abruptly and uncontrollably. It was an extraordinary moment filled with tension. Investors, who until then believed in the market's strength, began to realize their fortunes were at risk. What started as a slight decline early in the morning quickly escalated into a cascade of selling. In a matter of hours, the situation spiraled to unimaginable levels, and the trading floors were filled with despair. The nature of the market, once driven by optimism, changed dramatically. Many small investors with little understanding of market phenomena began to sell their stocks in a panic. It was a domino effect. As stocks dropped, more people tried to offload them to avoid deeper losses, which only fueled the decline. Banks and brokerage firms, for their part, were caught off guard. While some large investors had already started quietly selling off their portfolios, the overall impact was devastating. The confidence that had been the backbone of growth vanished in an instant. On the streets of New York, panic was visible. Investors crowded the doors of brokerage houses and banks, trying to grasp how the situation had deteriorated so quickly. At that time, news didn't circulate as fast as it does today, which added to the mystery surrounding what was happening. Many didn't have immediate access to information about the stock drops, leading to even more chaos. It felt like something extraordinary was happening, but no one knew how to respond. This marked the beginning of a dark sequence of days that would forever change the global economic history. Even big businessmen, once considered untouchable, were affected. John D. Rockefeller, one of the richest and most influential men of the era, attempted to intervene by publicly buying large amounts of stocks to restore confidence in the market. He hoped this would calm the panic and show there was still hope. But despite his efforts, the damage was done. Fear had spread irreversibly. It was like trying to stop an avalanche with bare hands. The destructive force was too great for any attempt at control. By the end of that day, over 12 million shares had been sold, and the market continued to fall. The volume was so overwhelming that the New York Stock Exchange had to take extraordinary measures to process all the transactions, something never seen before. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European markets began feeling the effects of the crash. The influence of the United States on the global economy meant that this crisis wouldn't remain confined to American soil. It would have consequences that rippled across the world. With the initial collapse, banks also began to feel the impact. Many had lent enormous amounts of money to investors buying stocks, and when stock prices plummeted, investors couldn't repay their debts. This was the beginning of a snowball effect that, within months, would become a full-blown financial meltdown. Incredibly, despite the clear signs of disaster, many still believed the market would recover, fueling a hope that would quickly prove futile. What started on Black Thursday didn't end there. It was only the first act in a financial tragedy that would have many chapters. In the following days, the crashes continued, and the impact was felt by everyone, from small shop owners to industrial giants. But the worst was yet to come, and the mystery of how the global economy would react to this catastrophe was just beginning to unfold. The chain reaction, from Black Thursday to the Great Depression. The initial stock market collapse in 1929 was just the beginning of a series of events that would trigger the Great Depression. In the days following Black Thursday, panic took over Wall Street and spread throughout the United States. The drop that began on October 24th intensified the following week, culminating on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, when the market lost even more value. In a matter of days, billions of dollars evaporated from the market, and what had been a local crisis began to spread as a global phenomenon. Large and small investors alike saw their fortunes disappear almost overnight, plunging the country into an unprecedented economic downturn. The consequences of the crash were not limited to the financial world. The real economy, which had already shown signs of weakness, began to collapse. Many companies, heavily reliant on investments and credit, were among the first to feel the impact. Mass bankruptcies began to occur. Factories shut down, leading to widespread layoffs. The unemployment rate skyrocketed, and families across the nation began to feel the weight of economic disaster. This extraordinary collapse in production and employment paved the way for one of the worst social crises in modern history. Banks, which had played a central role in financing the economy, were also caught in the storm. Many had lent vast sums of money to investors to purchase stocks, believing that the market would continue to grow indefinitely. When stock prices collapsed, banks were left with enormous unpaid debts. As a result, hundreds of banks began to fail, causing widespread panic among the public. People rushed to withdraw their savings, fearing they would lose everything, but most arrived too late. This phenomenon of bank runs spread, deepening the crisis of confidence in the financial system. While the United States struggled with this catastrophe, the crisis began to spread worldwide. European economies, already weakened by World War I, were hit particularly hard. Countries like Germany and the United Kingdom, which depended on trade and American investments, felt the effects of the crash almost immediately. As the global economy crumbled, American exports plummeted, worsening the situation at home. International trade, which had been seen as a solution to many economic problems, virtually stopped. The incredible thing was how a crisis on Wall Street could reverberate so devastatingly in so many parts of the world. During this period, many theories emerged about the causes of the crash. Some blamed excessive speculation and unchecked greed among investors, while others pointed to deeper structural flaws in the global economy. Indeed, the lack of regulation in the financial markets allowed the speculative bubble to grow unchecked. But other, more complex factors also contributed to the disaster. Agriculture, for example, had been in crisis for years, deeply affecting the income of millions of rural Americans, setting the stage for a larger economic collapse that the stock market crash merely accelerated. In the months that followed, the U.S. government under President Herbert Hoover attempted several measures to contain the collapse, but most proved ineffective. Hoover's belief that the economy would correct itself proved fatal for many. Policies like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which increased tariffs on imports, only worsened the situation by choking international trade. The extraordinary thing was that, instead of adopting aggressive measures to stop the crisis, the government hesitated, increasing the suffering of millions. The Great Depression was not only an economic crisis, but also a social one. Millions lost their homes, jobs, and savings. Poverty and hunger became commonplace in a country that, just a few years earlier, had experienced one of the greatest periods of prosperity. Despair spread, and confidence in the capitalist system was profoundly shaken. However, as with every great crisis, it also paved the way for extraordinary changes that would unfold in the years to come. Social impact and mass unemployment. As the stock market collapsed, the social impact on American society was devastating and transformative. Unemployment, which had already been rising before the crash, skyrocketed to extraordinary levels. In just a few months, millions of Americans lost their jobs, and factories that once thrived with the pace of industrial growth began to close their doors. Workers who once felt secure with steady wages and stable routines saw their lives turned upside down. The Great Depression wasn't just a financial crisis. It was also a crisis of identity for millions who depended on their jobs for survival. The feeling of helplessness and despair engulfed many families, especially among the working class. In the cities, the phenomenon of forgotten men began to emerge. These men, once hard-working providers, now found themselves wandering the streets in search of any available work. The number of homeless people rose dramatically, and entire sections of major metropolitan areas were transformed into Hoovervilles, makeshift shantytowns where people tried to survive in extreme conditions. The name was a direct critique of President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for failing to solve the crisis. At every corner, the extraordinary contrast between the glitz of the previous decade and the misery of the present was striking. In rural areas, the situation was no less tragic. Farmers, already in crisis since the early 1920s, were particularly affected. Many had taken out loans to modernize their properties, trusting that crop prices would rise. When demand plummeted and prices fell, these farmers found themselves unable to repay their debts. The result was a wave of foreclosures, forcing entire families to abandon their land. For many of these families, migration became the only option, leading to mass movements toward other regions of the country in search of new opportunities or simply hoping to survive. The psychological impact of the Great Depression was as deep as the economic one. For many, especially small business owners and low-income workers, the future seemed bleak and uncertain. The idea of the American dream, the promise of prosperity and success for all, quickly vanished. The extraordinary optimism that marked the 1920s was replaced by a collective sense of despair. Soup kitchen lines became a common sight in every major city, and charity was, for many, the only means of survival. For women, the Great Depression brought unique challenges. With a high unemployment rate among men, many found themselves forced to seek work to support their families. However, the job market was also saturated, and opportunities for women were extremely limited. Gender discrimination was widespread, and many employers preferred to hire men, even for low-paying jobs. Despite these obstacles, women played a crucial role in keeping their families afloat by seeking alternative means of income, such as sewing or selling homemade food. This extraordinary effort by women to keep their families together during such difficult times was rarely recognized at the time, but it was essential to helping many survive the storm. Children were also affected by the crisis. Many were pulled out of school to help their families work. Malnutrition and hunger became recurring problems, severely affecting the development of an entire generation. Families that had once lived in comfort now struggled for basic survival. The children who grew up during this period carried with them the traumas and lessons of an era marked by insecurity and constant fear of losing everything. For many, the experience of the Great Depression shaped their worldview and deeply influenced their choices and attitudes in the decades that followed. The social impact of the Great Depression wasn't confined to the United States. Around the world, the economic crisis fueled the rise of radical political movements and increased social tensions. In many countries, poverty and mass unemployment led to political instability, creating fertile ground for dictatorships and extremist ideologies. In the U.S., however, the next big step would be an innovative response that would change the trajectory of history and redefine the role of government in the economy and society. The government's response, Roosevelt's New Deal. Amidst the economic crisis and widespread despair, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president in 1932 with a promise to bring an innovative solution to the collapse. The New Deal, as his economic recovery policy came to be known, was a series of extraordinary measures designed to revive the American economy and restore public confidence. Roosevelt believed the government needed to intervene actively to stabilize the financial system, create jobs, and provide direct support to struggling families. This approach was a complete departure from his predecessor Herbert Hoover's stance, who believed the economy would correct itself. One of Roosevelt's first actions was to restructure the banking system, which was on the verge of collapse. Early in his presidency, he implemented a bank holiday, temporarily closing all banks to prevent further bank runs. During this period, the government inspected financial institutions, allowing only healthy banks to reopen. Additionally, the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, ensured that bank deposits were protected, helping to restore public confidence in the financial system. This was an innovative move, demonstrating a clear intent to protect small savers and prevent another catastrophe. The New Deal also brought large-scale public works programs to reduce unemployment and improve the country's infrastructure. The government launched projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, which built hydroelectric plants and dams, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, which employed young men in environmental conservation work. These initiatives not only created millions of jobs, but also helped transform the nation's infrastructure and natural resources. The nature of these projects was extraordinary, as they not only relieved unemployment, but also paved the way for long-term development, improving living conditions for future generations. Another crucial aspect of the New Deal was labor law reform and the creation of Social Security programs. In 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act, a landmark piece of legislation that established a pension system for workers and benefits for the unemployed and disabled. The incredible thing about this measure was that, for the first time, the federal government was taking responsibility for ensuring a social safety net for the most vulnerable. The New Deal also established labor rights, such as minimum wage and limited working hours, providing greater protection for workers who had long suffered from exploitation. Roosevelt also understood the importance of communication in generating public trust and engagement. He used his famous fireside chats, radio addresses where he spoke directly to the American people, to explain his policies clearly and accessibly. Through this approach, he managed to humanize the government and reassure a population living through times of extreme uncertainty. This ability to speak directly to people was an influential aspect of his presidency, demonstrating his understanding that economic recovery required not only political actions, but also a restoration of social confidence. Still, the New Deal was not without its critics. Many in the business sector and conservative politicians accused Roosevelt of leading the country towards socialism. Others felt he was expanding the power of the federal government too much. But for the majority of the population, his policies represented renewed hope for better days. In times of such deep crisis, extraordinary measures were necessary, and the New Deal managed, at least, to stop the continued collapse and provide a light at the end of the tunnel. While the New Deal had a profound impact on the economic recovery, the crisis didn't end immediately. The recession remained a looming shadow, and the path to full recovery would be long and fraught with challenges. The government's response was a crucial step, but global events, as we'll see, would also play a key role in ending the Great Depression. The role of World War II in economic recovery. Although the New Deal was an important step in stabilizing the U.S. economy, it was World War II that gave the decisive push for full recovery. When the war broke out in 1939, the United States was still in the process of recovering from the Great Depression, but the country's entry into the war in 1941 brought about an extraordinary transformation. Mobilization for the war effort required a massive expansion of industrial production, which created millions of jobs and reactivated the economy in a way that domestic policies had not been able to achieve on their own. The war was a global phenomenon that demanded a complete restructuring of the economy. The U.S. government began investing heavily in factories to produce weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and other supplies needed for the war. Industries that had been idle or operating below capacity were revitalized. Cities dependent on large factories began to see their economies rebound, with workers returning to employment en masse. In just a few years, the American economy transitioned from a state of deep crisis to the peak of production, driven by the urgent need to win the conflict. Unemployment, one of the greatest problems during the Great Depression, virtually disappeared during the war period. Men were drafted into the military, and at home, factories needed workers to keep up with production. This created space for a significant social change. For the first time, women played a central role in the workforce, taking on positions in factories and industries that had previously been exclusively for men. The phenomenon of Rosie the Riveters became a symbol of the extraordinary effort of American women on the home front. This movement not only contributed to the success of the war economy, but also planted the seeds for future changes in women's roles in society. In addition, the nature of war financing played a fundamental role in economic recovery. The federal government dramatically increased its spending, funding the war effort through loans and the issuance of bonds. This injected a massive amount of money into the economy, boosting consumption and production across all sectors. For many Americans, buying war bonds was not only a patriotic duty, but also a safe way to invest their savings, which helped restore confidence in the financial system, shaken since the 1929 collapse. The war economy also generated extraordinary innovations. The conflict accelerated technological development in various fields, including medicine, communications, engineering, and aeronautics. Many of the advances made during this period would benefit the civilian economy after the war. This era of industrial innovation laid the foundation for the post-war economic boom, solidifying the United States as the world's largest economic power. The combination of high productivity and technological innovation created a solid base for sustainable growth in the following decades. However, the war's impact on recovery wasn't only economic. The conflict united the population around a common goal, creating a sense of purpose that had been lost during the darkest years of the Great Depression. Patriotism and collective effort helped rebuild the country's social fabric, which had been deeply shaken. The extraordinary sense of unity that the war brought to Americans was a driving force not only for winning the conflict, but also for rebuilding a nation that, just years earlier, had been on the brink of collapse. While it's true that the war brought about economic recovery, it's important to recognize the high human cost of this process. Millions of lives were lost in the conflict, and many American families suffered the pain of losing loved ones. At the same time, the post-war world emerged profoundly transformed, with the United States at the forefront of global economic and political power. Thus, the end of the Great Depression was sealed not only by successful domestic policies, but also by the extraordinary global impact of a war that would change the course of history forever. Lessons from the 1929 crash and its legacy on financial regulation. The 1929 crash left deep scars on American society and the global financial system, but it also brought valuable lessons that would influence the course of economic history. After the collapse in the Great Depression, it became clear that the financial market couldn't operate without effective regulation. The lack of oversight, rampant speculation, and the fragility of the banking system were identified as the main causes of the crisis. It was extraordinary how, in such a short period, unshakable confidence in the market turned into total distrust. From these lessons, governments and economists understood the need to create a more robust system to prevent such catastrophes from happening again. One of the first responses to this need for control was the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, in 1934 as part of Roosevelt's New Deal. The SEC was established to regulate the stock market and ensure that companies were transparent about their finances and business practices. It was an innovative measure that aimed to protect investors from fraud and manipulation, ensuring that the market operated more fairly and organized. The incredible thing is that, before the SEC's creation, many investors didn't even have access to basic information about the companies they invested in, allowing for extremely risky and unethical practices to flourish. Along with the SEC, another significant change was the separation between commercial and investment banks, a measure implemented by the Glass-Steagall Act, also in 1933. This legislation prevented banks from using customer deposits to speculate in the stock market, a common practice in the 1920s that contributed to the financial collapse. The idea was for commercial banks to focus on safer, more stable activities like loans and savings accounts, while investment banks dealt with the riskier areas. This move helped restore confidence in the banking system, which had been profoundly shaken by the crisis. The collapse also revealed the importance of a social safety net to protect the population in times of economic crisis. The creation of the Social Security Act in 1935 was a direct response to the suffering caused by the Great Depression, establishing a social security system that included pensions and unemployment insurance. This was an extraordinary innovation in the American context, where the federal government took responsibility for ensuring a minimum level of economic security for its citizens. The impact of this system was profound and helped build a more resilient society, better prepared to face future economic challenges. Another important lesson was the need to balance the relationship between government and the market. Before the 1929 crash, the dominant ideology in the United States was that the market should be free from government interference, a belief that ultimately allowed speculative bubbles and irresponsible practices to flourish. The crisis showed that, without proper oversight, the market could become a chaotic and dangerous place. After the collapse, the notion that the government needed to intervene to ensure economic stability became widely accepted. This was one of the most influential legacies of the crisis, which redefined the role of the state in the economy. Even today, the 1929 crash serves as a living example of the consequences of speculative euphoria and the lack of control over financial markets. It continues to be studied by economists, investors, and regulators, not only as a historical event, but as a warning of what can happen when markets lose touch with economic reality. The 2008 financial crisis, for example, brought to light many of the same problems of excessive speculation and lack of regulation seen in 1929. The incredible thing is how history has the power to repeat itself, even when the lesson seems so clear. Therefore, the 1929 crash, remains a benchmark not only in economic history, but also in understanding human nature when faced with risk and opportunity. Finally, the legacy of the crash was not only economic, but also cultural. It shaped how people view the stock market, risk, and the role of government. The distrust that emerged after the crisis continues to influence how many people and institutions approach investments. This combination of economic and cultural lessons made the 1929 crash not only an extraordinary event, but a transformative one, whose effects are still felt and debated today. The global impact of the crash and international economic crisis. Although the 1929 stock market crash began in the United States, its effects quickly spread across the globe, creating an unprecedented international economic crisis. At the time, the global economy was already interconnected, and the U.S., which had become an economic powerhouse after World War I, was one of the largest creditors and exporters of goods in the world. Thus, when the American stock market collapsed, the extraordinary impact was felt in many countries, especially in Europe. The financial crisis in the U.S. abruptly halted the flow of credit and international trade, creating a domino effect that hit nearly every industrialized nation. In Europe, the crisis was particularly devastating. Countries like Germany, which relied heavily on American loans to rebuild after the war, saw their economies unravel. The German government had borrowed large sums from the United States to finance post-war recovery, and when American credit dried up after the crash, the country plunged into a new crisis. Unemployment soared, and inflation, which had been a problem in the early 1920s, once again threatened economic stability. The mystery of how this international crisis would be resolved dominated political and economic debates of the time. The United Kingdom was also hit hard. Although London remained an important financial center, the British economy had been weakened since the end of World War I. Dependence on trade with the United States and the British colonies made the impact of the crash inevitable. Declining exports and the withdrawal of foreign investments triggered a severe recession. The British government was forced to adopt austerity measures, resulting in cuts to public services and rising poverty. Incredibly, for many of these European economies, the economic depression seemed like an endless cycle of crises, each deeper than the last. Beyond Europe, Latin American countries were deeply affected by the crisis. Most of these nations relied on exporting commodities, such as coffee, sugar, and minerals, and the United States was one of the main markets for these products. When American demand for commodities collapsed, prices plummeted. Countries like Brazil and Argentina, which had been experiencing growth driven by exports, were hit hard. The decline in commodity prices led to rural impoverishment and growing political instability in these countries. The extraordinary cycle of economic dependence and fragility was brutally exposed by the global crisis. Responses to the crisis vary from country to country. In the United States, as we saw with the New Deal, the government adopted aggressive measures to try to reverse the depression. In Europe, however, solutions were more fragmented. Germany, for example, saw the rise of extremist movements like Nazism, which capitalized on the population's despair to offer radical solutions. The influence of the economic crisis on the rise of authoritarian regimes cannot be underestimated. In many countries, economic desperation created fertile ground for populist leaders to gain power, promising quick fixes to problems that seemed unsolvable. The historical and political impact of this period was extraordinary and tragic. Another significant global impact was the collapse of international trade. During the 1920s, global trade had been growing, but the 1929 crisis abruptly ended this trend. Many countries responded to the depression by imposing protectionist barriers, such as tariffs, to protect their domestic industries. A clear example of this was the Smoot-Hawley Act passed in the United States, which significantly increased import tariffs, prompting retaliation from other nations. This increase in trade barriers resulted in an even sharper decline in global commerce, worsening the global recession. The incredible thing is that, instead of uniting global economies to seek solutions, the initial response was to fragment the international economic system further. The impact of the 1929 crash was not only economic but also political and social, shaping global history in unforeseen ways. The crisis respected no borders, and its influence reverberated across continents, creating a climate of uncertainty and chaos. The lesson many economists took from this period is that global economic interdependence, without proper regulation and coordination, can lead to crises that spread with frightening speed. The Great Depression, born from the 1929 crash, was an extraordinary event that not only destroyed economies, but also shaped the course of global politics and relations for decades. The psychological and cultural impact of the 1929 crash. The psychological impact of the 1929 crash was as profound as its economic consequences. The unshakable confidence in the stock market, which had seemed so certain, disintegrated abruptly. For many Americans, the collapse brought about an extraordinary shift in how they viewed capitalism, work, and financial security. Before the crash, the stock market was seen as a gateway to quick and easy wealth, but after the fall, it became synonymous with risk, betrayal, and loss. People who had invested their entire savings saw their fortunes disappear almost overnight, and this created a widespread sense of despair. The belief in the American dream was deeply shaken. This economic crisis brought to the surface the fear of uncertainty. The security many thought they had built through hard work and investments evaporated quickly. For those who lived through the Great Depression, the trauma was lasting. They learned, in the hardest way possible, the unpredictable nature of the financial system. This phenomenon generated a culture of distrust toward the stock market and credit, a mindset that would last for decades. Families who had once spent confidently now saved cautiously, fearing what the future might bring. The extraordinary thing is that this feeling of caution didn't just affect those who lost everything, but also future generations who grew up with the shadow of the crash hanging over their financial decisions. Culturally, the impact of the 1929 crash was vast. It influenced literature, cinema, and the arts in general, reflecting the struggles and despair of the time. Authors like John Steinbeck captured the suffering and the search for dignity amid poverty in works like The Grapes of Wrath. This period also led to a wave of films and plays that explored the hardships of life during the Depression. Fiction began to portray the extraordinary contrast between the opulence of the 1920s and the harsh reality of the 1930s. Cinema, in particular, became a form of escapism for many Americans, offering a brief respite from the harsh realities of everyday life. Music was also deeply marked by this historical moment. Blues and jazz, genres that already reflected the struggles of life for many African Americans, became even more influential during the Depression, capturing the pain and resilience of a people enduring adversity. Songs from this period spoke of loss, struggle, but also hope. The extraordinary power of music as a vehicle for expressing collective emotion was evident, with artists like Billie Holiday and Woody Guthrie using their voices to tell the stories of those hardest hit by the crisis. The 1929 crash also had a profound psychological impact on the economic and financial elites. Many large investors, who had been considered untouchable before the fall, saw their fortunes evaporate. For them, the collapse was not just a financial loss, but a devastating blow to their sense of identity and status. Some even went so far as to commit suicide, unable to cope with the shame and failure. This extraordinary collapse of confidence among business elites led to a reevaluation of their practices, and some began to advocate for stronger market regulation, something unthinkable just a few years earlier. Another significant cultural shift was the change in the perception of the government's role. Before the crash, there was a strong belief in laissez-faire, the idea that the government should interfere as little as possible in the economy. But the extraordinary impact of the Great Depression forced a reconsideration of this principle. A population that had once prided itself on self-sufficiency now demanded more protection from the government. The idea that the state should guarantee a social safety net began to gain traction, transforming the political culture of the United States and other Western countries. Roosevelt's New Deal was a direct response to this cultural and psychological shift, and its acceptance by the population demonstrated how the view of the relationship between citizens and government had drastically changed. Lastly, the 1929 crash and its cultural and psychological repercussions influenced entire generations. Even after the Great Depression ended, the memory of the collapse remained a living lesson that prosperity can be fleeting and that, without a solid foundation, extraordinary optimism can quickly turn into tragedy. This experience shaped the behavior of investors, workers, and politicians for decades, creating a society more cautious and aware of the risks the stock market and global economy can pose. The legacy of the 1929 crash for the modern financial system. The 1929 crash left a deep and lasting legacy on the modern financial system, shaping economic, regulatory, and social policies that persist to this day. The collapse revealed the vulnerability of markets without proper regulation and the extraordinary impact a crisis can have on the global economy. One of the most important lessons from this event was the need for a balance between free markets and government intervention to ensure financial stability. This principle became the foundation of the reforms that shaped the financial system in the 20th century and continues to influence economic decisions today. The creation of regulatory institutions, such as the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC), was an innovative step toward overseeing financial markets and ensuring that crises like the one in 1929 wouldn't happen with the same intensity again. Additionally, the introduction of deposit insurance systems like the FDIC helped restore confidence in the banking system, preventing future bank runs in times of crisis. The incredible thing is that before the crash, these safeguards barely existed, and the financial system operated in a kind of no man's land, where risk and speculation could run rampant with few immediate consequences. The collapse proved that such an approach was unsustainable in the long run. The separation between commercial and investment banks, established by the Glass-Steagall Act, was another significant part of the 1929 crash's legacy. This law, which lasted until the late 20th century, was implemented to prevent banks from using depositor money to make risky investments in the stock market. Although it was repealed in 1999, many argue that the absence of regulations like this contributed to the 2008 financial crisis. This shows how the legacy of the 1929 crash remains relevant, influencing debates about the role of regulation in the modern financial system. Beyond regulation, the 1929 crash had a lasting impact on how people perceive risk. The event served as a permanent reminder, warning investors and economists that speculative euphoria can have disastrous consequences. Many experts cite the crash as a classic example of a financial bubble, where stock prices soared to unsustainable levels due to rampant speculation, with little connection to the actual value of the assets. This concept of a bubble has become central to modern financial studies, with examples like the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s and the housing crisis of 2008, showing how the extraordinary phenomenon of 1929 continues to be a crucial guide in understanding market dynamics. Another influential aspect of the crash's legacy was its impact on economic thinking. Before 1929, the dominant belief was that the market, left to its own devices, would correct its failures. However, the crash demonstrated that this theory, while appealing during times of growth, could be disastrous in times of crisis. This opened the door for the development of Keynesian economics, which argues that the government must actively intervene in the economy to mitigate the effects of recessions. Keynesian policies, applied on a large scale after World War II, shaped the global economy for decades, proving to be an effective response to the failures exposed by the 1929 collapse. On the international stage, the 1929 crash and the Great Depression altered how global economies interacted. Before the crisis, global trade and investments flowed freely, but the collapse led many countries to adopt protectionist policies. These trade barriers exacerbated the crisis, teaching the world that economic isolation in times of crisis can be just as harmful as the depression itself. The creation of institutions like the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank after World War II was an attempt to prevent an extraordinary crisis like 1929 from spreading globally without a coordinated response. These organizations continue to play crucial roles in the international economy today. Finally, the 1929 crash left a significant cultural legacy. It changed how people think about money, risk, and investment. The fear of financial collapse is a constant shadow over markets, and the experience of that time is often cited as an example of how prosperity can turn into catastrophe. The extraordinary caution many investors adopted throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, as well as the regulations aimed at limiting speculation, are direct reflections of the lessons learned from the crash. It shaped not only the financial system, but also how societies approach the balance between ambition and prudence. After everything we've discussed, can you see how the 1929 crash was a turning point in history? The lessons from this crisis are just as important today as they were back then. Are we paying attention to the signs the market gives us? What can you do to protect yourself from future crises? History has shown that those who study the past are better prepared for the future. So why not keep learning and diving deeper into these topics? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep getting more content that can change your understanding of economics and finance.